The first time High Strategist Veolyra of the Khepri Dominion saw Elias Grant, she dismissed him as insignificant. He stood alone in the reception chamber of the orbital citadel, hands folded behind his back, posture relaxed in a way that bordered on disrespectful. He wore no ceremonial armor, no medals, no visible weapons, just a plain human uniform, faded at the seams. Compared to the towering insectoid nobles around him, with their iridescent carapaces and jeweled crests, he looked fragile, temporary, replaceable. Veolyra's multifaceted eyes tracked him with cool disinterest as she addressed the council. "This," she said, gesturing with a bladed forelimb, "is the Terran representative assigned to our joint logistics agreement?" "Yes, High Strategist," replied an aide. Elias Grant, former industrial engineer, civilian conscript during the Third Expansion War. Veolyra clicked softly, a sound of mild annoyance. "You sent us a factory worker to negotiate the rebuilding of contested systems?" Elias didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He simply met her gaze, steady, unblinking, human eyes holding hers without challenge or fear. "Yes," he said calmly, "because factories win wars." A ripple of irritated murmurs moved through the chamber. Veolyra leaned forward on her throne-like seat. "Wars are won by fleets, soldier. By strategy. By sacrifice." Elias nodded once. "I agree." There was something in his tone that made her pause. Not arrogance. Not defiance. Certainty. Still, she dismissed it. Humans were young in the galactic community. Loud. Emotion-driven. They spoke of sacrifice as if it were noble, as if it were something to be admired rather than calculated. The Khepri had fought wars for millennia. They understood cost. They measured it in territory lost and resources gained. Individual suffering was irrelevant. At least, that was what Veolyra believed. The war had ended 6 cycles earlier. The human-Khepri conflict, brief, violent, and devastating, had burned across 5 star systems before the Coalition forced a ceasefire. To Veolyra, it had been a necessary correction. Humanity had expanded too fast, ignored borders, tested Khepri patience. They had been punished. Yet here stood a human, alive, unbowed, tasked with overseeing reconstruction on worlds that had once belonged to both sides. For weeks, Veolyra observed Elias during joint inspections. He never complained about the damaged infrastructure, even when entire habitats were reduced to skeletal frames drifting in vacuum. He spoke respectfully to Khepri engineers and patiently to human workers, bridging cultural gaps with an ease that irritated her. More troubling was how others responded to him. Human laborers straightened when he approached. Khepri drones adjusted protocols without being ordered. Even hardened veterans on both sides grew quiet in his presence. Veolyra couldn't understand it. He carried no visible authority. So one cycle, during a tour of a shattered orbital shipyard, she decided to confront him directly. "You are not a soldier," she said as they stood overlooking the wreckage. "Yet you speak to veterans as an equal. Why?" Elias rested his hands on the railing, eyes tracing the twisted hulls drifting below. "Because I worked where they fought." "That is not the same." "No," he agreed. "It's worse." Veolyra's mandibles tightened. "Explain." He was silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he unfastened his jacket. Beneath the uniform, his body was a map of scars. Burn marks traced jagged paths across his arms. Old shrapnel wounds puckered his skin. Along his ribs, pale surgical lines intersected like crude stitching. One shoulder bore the unmistakable indentation of a regrown joint, human biotech imperfectly restoring what had once been destroyed. Veolyra recoiled despite herself. Khepri warriors bore scars proudly, but these were different. These were not ceremonial or earned in single glorious moments. They were cumulative, endless. "What is this?" she asked, her voice quieter. Elias didn't sound bitter. The cost. She had never seen the cost of war like this. Veilira had studied casualty reports, resource depletion charts, population decline curves. She had approved orbital strikes and blockade starvation measures with clinical precision. But this was a ledger written on flesh. "How did a factory worker receive combat injuries?" she demanded. Elias gave a small, humorless smile. "Factories are targets. We build ships, ammo, medkits. When the bombs fall, they don't check your job title." He tapped the largest scar on his chest. "That one's from a ceiling beam. Collapsed when the Khepri fleet hit our industrial ring over Karthus." Veilira stiffened. That strike was meant to disable production, not kill civilians, he finished gently. "I know." He refastened his jacket, but the image lingered. "You could have fled," she said. "Your species values individual survival." "We value each other," Elias corrected. "I stayed because if I left, someone else would have taken my place. Someone younger, less experienced, more likely to die." Veilira said nothing. For the first time since the war, uncertainty crept into her calculations. Their interactions changed after that. Veilira found herself asking questions she had never considered relevant. How many humans were conscripted? "Everyone," Elias replied. "Not all into combat, but everyone contributed." "And those who refused?" He shrugged. "Some went to prison. Some ran. Some broke under the weight. War doesn't care either way." They walked through refugee habitats together. Veilira watched as Elias knelt to speak with injured workers, his voice low, familiar. He remembered names. Asked about families. "These are not soldiers," she said once. "No," he replied. "They're survivors." The word unsettled her. Khepri doctrine taught that survival was assumed for those worthy of it. Weakness was culled by necessity. Yet here were humans, broken, scarred, exhausted, still rebuilding. Why? During one inspection, a Khepri security officer snapped at a human child who strayed into a restricted zone. Before Veilira could intervene, Elias stepped forward. "Easy," he said quietly. "She's just curious." "She violates protocol," the officer hissed. "So did I," Elias replied. "I'm still here." The officer hesitated, then backed down. Veilira watched, disturbed by the realization that Elias wielded influence not through rank, but through shared suffering. The turning point came during the Ashara incident. A derelict minefield, left over from the war, detonated near a joint reconstruction convoy. Explosions tore through transport barges, venting atmosphere and personnel into space. Veilira arrived on the scene to find chaos. Khepri commanders prioritized asset recovery. Human crews scrambled to save lives. And Elias Grant was gone. "Where is the human?" Veilira demanded. A medic pointed toward a breached habitat module. "Inside. Helping evacuate." "That area is unstable," Veilira said. "He will not survive." "He knows," the medic replied. Without thinking, Veilira followed. Inside the module, smoke and debris filled the air. Elias was dragging an unconscious Khepri engineer toward an airlock, blood seeping from a fresh wound in his leg. "Leave him," Veilira ordered. "Your life is more valuable to your people." Elias looked at her, breathing hard. "So is his to his." Another explosion rocked the structure. "Why?" Veilira demanded. "After everything we have done to your species, why save us?" Elias met her gaze, Pain etched across his face. Because if we don't stop counting lives differently, he said, we'll never stop the war. The ceiling collapsed. Veolyra acted on instinct, shielding him with her armored body as debris crashed around them. They survived. Barely. In the aftermath, the coalition conducted an inquiry. Veolyra testified. For the first time in her long career, she argued against strict reparations, against punitive occupation. She cited inefficiency, instability, future rebellion risks. But privately, she knew the truth. She had seen the cost. Not in numbers. In scars. When Elias recovered in the medical bay, Veolyra visited him. You should have died, she said. Yeah, he replied weakly. I've been hearing that a lot. She hesitated, then spoke words that had never crossed her mandibles before. I was wrong. Elias blinked. About what? About humans. About war. She lowered her head, a gesture of respect among the Khepri. Your scars carry more strategy than all my simulations. He studied her for a long moment. Then maybe the next war won't happen. Veolyra looked away, gazing out at the stars beyond the viewport. I will ensure it does not, she said. Years later, history would record that the human, Khepri armistice held. That joint systems flourished. That doctrines changed. But in a private chamber of the Khepri citadel, high strategist Veolyra kept a single image on display, a human factory worker, standing amid ruins, jacket open, scars exposed, not as a threat, but as a reminder. She had never seen the cost of war, until the human showed her his scars. And humanity, scarred yet unbroken, had changed the galaxy not with conquest, but with endurance. The scars never truly healed. Even after months of regenerative therapy, even after the pain dulled to a distant ache, Elias Grant could still feel them when he moved. They pulled when he stretched. They burned when the station's artificial gravity fluctuated. Some nights, they ached for no reason at all, as if remembering things he tried not to. He had learned to live with that. What he hadn't learned to live with was silence. The Reconstruction Summit chamber was quiet in a way that felt wrong, too expectant, too heavy. Delegates from 14 species filled the circular tiers, chitin clicking softly, robes whispering, translators humming under the surface of the air. At the center stood a single human podium. Elias adjusted the mic with one hand. High strategist Veolyra stood across from him, her carapace polished but unadorned. No war crests. No command sigils. For the first time since he had met her, she wore nothing that declared dominance. Only responsibility. The floor recognizes Elias Grant of Terra, announced the coalition speaker. Elias took a breath. He hadn't planned to speak. He had come to oversee logistics, sign material orders, argue over supply corridors and labor allocations. That was what he was good at. Quiet, necessary work. But then Veolyra had requested the address. And she had looked at him, not as a superior, not as an enemy, but as someone asking for help. So he spoke. I'm not a soldier, Elias began. I never was. I worked in a fabrication ring that made pressure seals and bulkhead frames. Things you only notice when they fail. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. I didn't choose the war. None of us did. But when it came, we showed up anyway. Because someone had to keep the lights on. Someone had to keep the ships flying. Someone had to stand in the fire so others could move forward. He paused, then did something no human delegate had ever done before the coalition. He removed his jacket. A ripple passed through the chamber. Even those who had seen his scars before had never seen them under full diplomatic lighting. Old burns catching the glow, healed fractures faintly luminous beneath synthetic skin, the uneven rhythm of a body rebuilt too many times. This, Elias said quietly, is what war costs when it doesn't kill you. No one interrupted him. I don't show this for sympathy. I don't want apologies. I'm here because every one of these scars was paid for by someone who believed the future mattered more than their comfort. Sometimes more than their life. He looked directly at Veolaira. And if we build the future the same way we built the war, by measuring lives like numbers, we'll be back here again. With new maps, new borders, new graves. Silence. Then Veolaira stepped forward. High Strategist Veolaira of the Khepri Dominion had commanded extermination fleets. She had ordered strikes that cracked moons and burned atmospheres away. Her name had once been spoken with fear across half the spiral arm. Now, she lowered herself before the assembled galaxy. Not kneeling, Khepri physiology made that impossible, but bowing her head in the deepest gesture of submission her species possessed. The Dominion acknowledges its failure, she said. Gasps rippled through the chamber. We believed war was an equation. Veolaira continued, voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. Resources expended. Territory gained. Losses acceptable. She raised her head and gestured toward Elias. We were wrong. Her multifaceted eyes swept the chamber. We never counted what survived. She turned back to him. Human Elias Grant showed me the cost we ignored. Not the dead, but the living. Those who carry war forward inside their bodies. Inside their minds. And still choose not to return it. She struck her forelimb against the floor once, a declaration. The Khepri Dominion renounces punitive doctrine. We will rebuild, not as overseers, but as equals. We will open our medical archives, our regeneration sciences, and our production networks to all species affected by this war. A murmur turned into a wave. Then applause. Not human applause. Coalition applause, clicking mandibles, resonant tones, harmonic vibrations that filled the chamber like thunder. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The galaxy changed slowly. It always did. But it did change. Joint medical stations adopted hybrid treatment protocols inspired by human trauma care, treating pain not as weakness, but as information. Khepri War Academies added a new required course, translated awkwardly, but sincerely into their language. Endurance ethics, the cost beyond victory. And on worlds once scorched by orbital fire, factories rose again, not as weapons plants, but as mixed-use habitats, staffed by species that had once tried to annihilate each other. Elias stayed where he always had on the ground. He oversaw production lines, trained foremen, and argued relentlessly for safety margins that others called excessive. He laughed more than he used to, slept better. The scars still hurt, but they didn't feel as heavy. One evening, standing on the balcony of a rebuilt orbital station, he found Veolaira beside him. You could have been something greater, she said. He smiled. I am. She considered that. You changed the course of the Dominion, Veolaira said. Historians will remember you. Elias shook his head. They shouldn't remember me. They should remember why it mattered. She looked at him, truly looked at him. The scars, she asked. The choice, he replied. Years later, when cadets, human, Khepri, and otherwise, walked the halls of the Coalition Peace Archive, they stopped before a simple display. No weapons, no flags, just a jacket, preserved behind transparent alloy. And beside it, a plaque written in dozens of languages. War is not measured by what it destroys, but by what still stands after. High Strategist Veolaira visited that display once every cycle. She stood silently, and every time, she remembered the moment she truly understood war, not when she commanded it, but when a human factory worker showed her his scars.